sixth of a series of webinars which the Bell Foundation has been hosting over the last few weeks for school staff, teacher educators and local authority teams as we face unprecedented challenges while we support the remote learning of our pupils for as long as lockdown and social distancing measures remain in place. We know that you're under unbelievable pressure, are very stretched and are doing a wonderful job in spite of it. Our aim at the Bell Foundation is to provide a bridge between practitioners, but also between practitioners and experts in the EAL field and a forum for exchanging ideas. The closure of schools in order to stop the spread of coronavirus is likely to have an adverse impact on the learning and attainment of many children who use English as an additional language. Right now, most EAL pupils are at home working independently on online learning packages, in many cases with limited exposure to a range of good models of English, which is a necessary condition for vocabulary growth and the development of fluency in English to take place. Many of these children lack or have limited access to the kinds of teaching approaches and support best suited to English language development alongside curriculum learning. These learning conditions are particularly demanding for pupils who are new to English or in the early acquisition stages, and those who entered late into the UK education system. And the disadvantage is even greater for those children whose parents do not speak any English or who have very low levels of proficiency in English. However, the good news is that these bilingual and multilingual children and their parents share an extremely valuable resource which can be put to good use to support their learning. And today's speaker is here to help with practical suggestions and to answer your questions. Before I introduce Olga, I just wanted to explain briefly the structure of this webinar. First of all, Olga will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes and will set the scene for the second and main part of her presentation, where she will share with us practical suggestions that school can recommend to parents so that they can support the home learning of their children. This means that there will be two opportunities for questions from the audience, one at the end of the first part of Olga's talk and another one at the end of her talk. If you want to ask a question, please use the chat box below and I will relay those questions to Olga. It would be great if you type your questions as and when they occur to you. Please confine your questions to today's topic and the areas of expertise that Olga will be talking about. We also welcome your ideas and practical suggestions, so feel free to add these to the chat box. Enough of me. I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Olga Cara. Olga, if you can briefly turn on your camera so that people can see you. Thank you very much. There she is. Thank you, Olga. Olga will switch off her camera shortly so that we can improve the quality of sound. Dr. Olga Cara is a senior researcher and a lecturer in Sociology of Education at UCL Institute of Education. She has an academic background in sociology and anthropology with research interests in ethnic and linguistic identities, multilingual families, the role of language in education, homeschool partnerships, and family learning as a tool of meaningful social integration. Olga is also a mum to 3 bilingual children and works in a Latvian school supporting Latvian families in London. She's also a chair of governors in a local primary school. Very welcome, Olga. It's a pleasure to have you. Over to you.
Hi, everybody. I will switch my camera off now and proceed with the presentation. So it's not that I'm disappearing, but please let me know if you can't hear me or if something goes wrong with the presentation. So as Silvana mentioned, I wanted to talk to you today about home learning and combination of still continuing learning from home and also dealing with some works and from schools. And the context is multilingual families with a range of different skills in English for both parents and pupils. Just a little introduction to myself, but again, Silvana already mentioned some of the things. I'm a researcher, so parts of this presentation are based in evidence and research evidence from different countries. So what we know up to date about learning different languages and involving different languages in broader learning. I'm also a parent, so some of my advice based on what I have experienced myself as a parent, but also as a teacher in a Latvian school here in England. So supporting parents, again, with decisions to make regarding use of languages, helping in answering their questions when they worry about their children and what strategies are best for their children to achieve better in schools. I'm also a school governor, so I have sort of more internal knowledge of schools. I'm not a teacher in a sense of I don't have teaching qualification, but I do teach at university. So I have knowledge of pedagogy, and I also deal with international students. So again, language becomes a challenge sometimes, and definitely something you always have to think about. So this presentation, as I mentioned, will be focusing on how parents can help their children with learning at home, but also for teachers, it's actually how teachers can encourage parents to help their children, even if maybe parents are struggling, they're not sure what to do. And also how then home languages can be actually used when engaging with work sent from schools in English and other subject areas, which often is a quite complex question. So if everything is sent from school in English, if school is happening in English, can I still use home languages? Can parents use and how they can use home languages? Should they be encouraged to use home languages? So these are main questions for today. Before we start talking about more practical suggestions about home languages and how those can be used, I wanted just to talk briefly about bilingualism and how children learn languages, but also how children learn in general and what we can take from that in order to create robust, practical advice for parents and for teachers as well. So there are many advantages of bilingualism. There is quite a lot of research about bilingualism, but it is very tricky to look into the use of different languages. So up to date, there are different ideas of how bilingualism can bring positive aspects into education, but what is definitely known is that if you speak more than one language, you are more tolerant, so your cultural competence goes up because it's not only language, but it's through language you learn different skills, you learn different behaviors, and that means you can understand other people and you can tolerate other people more because you can understand even if the behavior is different, where they come from, so you can relate to them. And this is very important for children and for humans really in general who live in a society where we have to live all together. For children and adults, bilingualism makes them secure with their identity and they have more self-confidence, and this links to better achievement at school. And it also helps children learning in general because they can think about their ideas in both, so in 2 or more languages, and also they can learn other languages more easily. And I will come to this point later in my presentation when we talk about practical solutions, practical advice. So talking about learning languages, there are 2 different phases of how we learn languages. Children have a assimilative phase where they can pretty much learn any language, and it's sort of instinctively they will observe different vocabulary, different pronunciation, melody of language, grammatical structures. They don't have to think about it. Linked to that is also language is not just a tool. It's not a technical aspect of our communication, but it has emotional attachment. That's why it's very important for very small children to use their home language, their parents' language, to establish that emotional attachment. But saying that, for younger children, it's not really confusing to hear different languages from different people. Our brain can distinguish it really easily. And it just requires some exposure to the language, and it requires emotional positive attachment to different groups of people. So you have parents, you have grandparents, you have teachers, and children are very good with assigning different languages to different groups of people. So all the children and adults learn language in a very different way. So sometime between the age of 9 and 12, the ability to learn it without really thinking about it, without bringing metacognition in, is lost, unfortunately. There's some people who can do it even after that age more or less successfully, but they are more exceptions than a general rule to how people learn the language. So then language learning passes to an analytic phase. So it's where all of us who learn languages as adults or later in life as teenagers, we would have learned languages in that way. And this is, again, something important to remember if you're working with different age groups. So what comes easier for younger children, even up to the age of primary school, will be very different for secondary school children. So if some children come just to secondary school and they have to switch the language, they will need support in a more like analytical way, explaining what language is, learning the words, rather than where for younger children, especially beginning stages of primary school, they only would need immersion and support and encouragement. So whether children are confused by learning with 2 or more languages, so it's not actually learning the language, but it's using more than one language while they're learning everything else. Child's little brain has really enough power and energy to cope with more than 2 languages without affecting their dominant language or impeding learning. They just need the right support. And it has been proven by decades of research and also by many, many countries where bilingualism is a norm or multilingualism is a norm. We have Canada, Belgium, Switzerland, Finland, where children learn more than one language, use in schools and at home more than one language at the same time. And the results are great. So just again, as a context, there's usually a question, does one have to learn one language properly first and then maybe taught other languages later? And this is actually really wrong and counterproductive. Studies concluded that learning more than one language simultaneously is much easier. And also if you're thinking about the window, what children have at this early age, it is better to learn 2 languages. And also just after having established one language, it's much harder to bring in the effort and more interaction and motivation to learn a second language. Again, another question about whether bilingual children start speaking later than monolingual children and sort of linking, is there a link between learning difficulties, speech difficulties and bilingualism? There is no evidence whatsoever that bilingual children learn to speak later. There's some children who do start speaking later, but they can be bilingual or monolingual. There is no really difference in that sense. It's just some children do it later than the others. So what about then children who do have speech problems or seeing a speech therapist? Do they have to stop using 2 languages? Would it be helpful? Again, there is evidence to show that bilingualism actually will make it almost not easier, but will support children better. But the support comes from the use of home languages. And again, with communication problems or with any learning problems, family support is very important. So if children are forced to use just one language, and in the context of England, it often would be English, children would lose that support and they would lose confidence of parents to support their children as well. So this links really to current situation a lot, but not only to current situation, it also links to generic idea about homework sent from schools. So should the parents stop them speaking their home language and speak only English in the context of, doing homework with their children, even if their English is not very good? Again, the suggestion would be based on the evidence that the main thing for children to learn is that they have positive and confident role models around them, and it's not the language which is used with them. So if parents' English is not so good, if they're not that confident, then children will not have these role models in front of them. And it will potentially discourage parents to support their children. And this definitely will decrease their achievement or will impede their achievement in learning in general. So safe and stable home environment facilitates learning, and it doesn't matter what language is used. So in general, learning in languages, the way our brain works is that all skills what children learn in one language are easily transferable to new languages. And that is why, let's say, if children are reading in their home language, they can transfer it much easier than to reading in English, or the other way around. So especially if you look at language and literacy environment, which is so important, again, it doesn't matter what language the literacy environment is created in, or what language or languages are used. The main thing is that the environment is rich and engaging. So how children learn, again, I mentioned this point, the main thing is environment and activities. If it's rich, engaging, interesting, and stimulating, it doesn't language as what language, it doesn't matter. And children, again, I mentioned it, can transfer what they learned in one language easily to the other language. So if we think about, as an example, literacy skills, so children who are familiar with books and stories, the idea of written text that they can read, some letters they can write, they find it easier to learn to read and write in English when they go to school. So parents don't have to use English before children start school, or actually after as well. They can continue with using their home languages. Bilingual children who are exposed to two different written languages, or even to different writing systems, the example would be Chinese, Mandarin, for example, and English, they have a better understanding of the relationship between how words look and sound if they compare it with their peers who speak English only. Because again, their brain is used to be flexible, and the understanding that different types of, pretty much drawings can convey different messages. So they only have to adjust their thinking and to learn different letters. But the idea about how to read and write is already there. So they also know how to, transferable skills are how to read the text, and the text, a combination of different drawings on paper. It conveys meaning, how different scripts are used, how use of context and different semantic clues helps, skills such as skimming, scanning, drawing inferences, so they're all transferable skills. So which means that parents at home, and if parents are asking, should I use more English, should I switch to English completely, they really don't have to do it unless they really want to. Because if they read with children in their home language, children can apply the same principle to English, and it will only speed up their learning. And of course, one point is that if they go back to school and receive no continuing support for their home language, this may impede their learning, or they can lose their ability to use the information they learned at home. So parents and teachers have to work together And when eventually children are back, it would be good to have discussions with parents how home learning went, and if it's about languages, what languages were used, and what would be the best ways to support children into this transition back to schools. But also maybe encouraging parents to do what they did through home learning. So parents would continue using their home languages, and then teachers would support with English. So some parents may say that they want to use English because they are worried that if they don't use English at home to support their children, children will not learn as well or will be disadvantaged when they go back to school. It's very important. So we're in families where parents' English is equally good as their home language. I would leave it to this decision. I would leave it to families to decide. Whereas if parents' English is not at a high level, or if they're struggling to support their children with schoolwork in English, I would have a discussion with parents to encourage them to use their home languages and to say, please don't worry. It's better for you to use your best language with your child because you have this confidence, you have this emotional attachment in families to use that home language, and your child will learn, and that your child will learn better because it's parents who engage with children what matters, and the sort of more subject and content knowledge what matters rather than the language it's delivered in. Last point before question and answer sort of session. It's important to think about family situation and home learning as such, and the way schools work now. It's very new for all of us. So I wouldn't encourage families to start suddenly using their home language, even though I'm completely in favor of using home languages, but this is not a time for these new and rapid changes. So I would make maybe a softer transition and think about what languages were used before, what children are actually used to bringing in more disruption is actually counterproductive in this way. So you have to think about languages, what a child feels comfortable with, and also what parents are comfortable with. So it could be that actually parents maybe continue using their home language if it's a more easier language for them, and children continue using English. And we can discuss it as an option after the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Olga. So the first pause that Olga makes and to give you an opportunity to ask some questions. So we've got a couple of questions here that our participants have been asking. If you want to turn on your video, Olga, so that people can see you, that would be great. So the first question is from Laura, and she says, I have a child who has parents that both speak different languages and they both speak to her in beginner English. She understands a bit of one of the parents speaking in her home language. However, the child cannot speak her home language, only beginner English. What would you suggest? She has been referred to speech and language therapists, but they have not taken her on. And I suggest we support her speaking English in school, which we already do.
I mean, there are quite many issues in this case. Obviously, it would be better in a way. So first time is lost. It would be much easier, and potentially child wouldn't have that problem if parents didn't use English and used their home language with the child, in particular where their English is at the beginner's level. But obviously, the situation is what it is. So I would suggest, so from a school point of view, obviously continuing supporting child learning English. I think I would be brave in this context. Of course, it depends on the child and parents. I would advise parents to switch to their home languages. It depends on the age of child and also how much child actually understands at least one of home languages. It also depends if they have two different languages, so what language parents use when they talk to each other. That maybe would be language of choice to encourage at home.
Thank you. Another question from Katarzynia. She says, Olga, you mentioned that it's easier to learn languages simultaneously. However, in the case of bilingual children, will not having a good basis in their first language impede their acquisition of another language? I have supported many EAL primary pupils, and the ones who struggle to speak and understand their first language are the ones who struggle most with learning English too. I'd be really interested in hearing your opinion.
So I think there are two different things in a way. I completely agree. So if there are no foundations in home language, then children will struggle with English. And there is evidence for that, research evidence, and I have experienced it myself. I think learning two languages simultaneously, it's more about thinking, if you think about home environment, so parents would continue using their home language, but living in England, you are surrounded and children are surrounded by English. So I think it's an encouragement for parents not to think that we cannot, because we want our children to speak English, we have to stop with home language because they can't do two at the same time. So it's encouraging parents to continue home language, and English will be there because of surrounding environment, because of school, and not being worried that they have to stop with home languages, especially as soon as children start primary school. I think this is one of the transition points where many parents would speak their home language up to nursery and definitely up to reception, and then just stop it thinking they need now to switch to English because they can only learn one language at a time.
Thank you. Sione says, some parents have asked what to do if a child doesn't want their parents to use home language. How do you encourage their children to talk or listen to home language?
So one of my last points I mentioned is the idea where parents can still continue using home language, and I would persevere, because if parents stop, that's it. So the situation is going to be resolved. But I wouldn't force children to answer in their home language back. I would just encourage children to maybe be also in situations where they have to use the language. So the idea of learning language and using language, there are two elements. One is exposure, and if parents continue using home language, children will get the exposure. Another one is the necessity. Children are very good in reading their parents. If children know that parents understand English, they will answer in English because it's easier, and this is what they're used to. But maybe if parents have grandparents, maybe if children can go to their parents' country where there are no people who understand English. I know nowadays it's very tricky to have that environment, but if you have to create the necessity, and the language will come. But I wouldn't force children saying, I'm not going to talk to you unless you answer in our language, because that disrupts the emotional attachment and emotional connection between children and parents. And also that then creates this negative attitude towards home language.
Thank you. And the last question before the second half. A question about what about if a child speaks their first language extensively with friends at school, then the first language at home with family? How do we ensure that they get rich input in English? This is referring to the concrete situation now of lockdown and social distancing. They may not get much practice time in a busy classroom when they go back.
I think children, we have to give credit to children. They learn constantly, so I wouldn't actually worry about that. And there are very few children who are not using YouTube. There are very few children who are not doing all this sort of English language environment things, because most of internet is in English. Most of games, online games, online interactions will be in English. So I wouldn't worry about that in a way. If they're older children who can read, then I would suggest encouraging them reading books in English, equally with like home language, and using again online opportunities to meet with their friends. Again, it depends on the age really, but I wouldn't worry about that.
Thank you, Olga. So shall we start with the second half? I'm going to switch my
Yeah.
video off, and if you
Okay. So moving to more practical aspects, and in a way with the questions, we already started talking about what can be done, what parents should be encouraged to do, what to answer if, parents ask all these questions. Just before we go into more practical advice, one thing about families are so diverse, and obviously you have this language element as well. So there are different types of families. So advice will be slightly different, and opportunities for language exposure and sort of creating this necessity of using the language will be very different for different families. Usually, roughly, you can put families into these three boxes. It's very tricky, but it's possible in generic terms. So you have both parents speak their home language to the child. So usually parents, this would be the language parents share, or it could be also sometimes where parents decided to use just that one language, even though they maybe their languages are different. So it's just language of one of the parents. But the idea is that it's the environment where you have one home language and then you have English in schools, with friends, in all other contexts. Then you have one parent speaks English, one parent speaks home language to the child. It's one of the quite traditional approaches where you have one person, one language. So this would be a case where you have mixed families. So we have one parent with English as their first language, and then another parent with another language. And there are different variations as to what language is used when parents speak to each other. And that will have influence on obviously dominant language for the child. So if one parent speaks English to the child, but also English is used between both parents, then English will be dominant for the child, most probably. And home language will be sort of more passive, so wouldn't be dominant. So then you can have both parents speak English to the child, but they speak home language between themselves. I think this is not the best situation. Again, I would leave this as for parents to decide, and they may have their reasons behind that, but this is not the best situation, because you can imagine how frustrating it could be to the child when he or she cannot understand what parents tell each other. You feel like you're left out. So it's not the best, but again, some parents decide to do it, and if it's an informed decision, that's absolutely fine. And there are many variations of this category. So thinking about advice to parents. And I will be focusing mainly on what to do at home, what to do at home with homework, and obviously in current situation with all the learning happening at home. So, and this is generic, just make it fun and don't think too hard. If it's not fun, if it feels like very pressured, too structured, it's not going to work, especially if you have this language element. And as we heard from questions, there will be different variations of frustration from parents wanting to use their home language, but then children not really wanting to do it, or the other way around, where parents are sort of struggling with English, or children struggling with English as well, or their home language. So to make it fun is really, really important. In a way, yes, you have to be very serious about the process, as it will require planning. It will require conscious decisions from parents to decide to use a particular language at particular time. So that's why I talk about informed decisions. Any decision is fine if you know what are the consequences and what are the results of that decision, or what is your justification in deciding to approach learning in one way or the other. And half of this is really just an attitude. It's a decision from parents to decide to do it. And obviously the other half, it's actual activities. So if you do something, how to do it. And all these activities and everything can be done in any language and in more than one language. The main thing, and this is for free, you don't have to pay for this, and this works for all children everywhere. Talk, and talk to your child. Obviously, in case of home languages, use your home language. This will help your children learn. When children are very young, from birth age 3, all the research shows parents who talk a lot and in many different ways to their children, they give the best present ever to their children. So their overall cognitive ability at later age is much higher compared to maybe families where languages are not used as often, and where children are not really receiving that much communication, where it's sort of more like one-sided or more just directions or instructions, or not almost talking at all. So the quality of speech is very, very important. If you think now in this environment where everybody is learning, from home, we have to support our children. Talk to your children about anything. Talk to their schoolwork. Talk to their either online games. Talk about their, PlayStation. It's still learning. You can find many, many things to discuss and to improve their learning from really anything. But don't settle for simple sentences or one-word answers, because think about the quality of speech. So it's not just asking, and getting a response of yes, no, or sort of and no really sort of linguistic or word response. So if you think about real conversation, it needs to take turns going back and forth at least 5 times. That means that so children and parents, they are in that space where they are learning, where they are talking to each other. And as I said, that's like the best thing you can do at any age, really. So engage in storytelling, that's like an extension for talk. So talking would be more like answers and questions and taking turns. Storytelling is where you have a narrative, a story. And again, this is like for free. You can do it during the day. You can do it in the morning. You can bring your own stories. And so linking maybe to families where literacy, so some languages, they don't have maybe like so many written books to use for parents in their home language, or parents are like struggling with maybe more formal approaches. Storytelling helps a lot. Remembering how children learn, how they improve their literacy. So if children can follow up a story, they understand how stories are created, their writing later on improves as well. And also maybe invent something like made up memories as well. So for children to distinguish between, like more formal writing and reading and formal ideas and something which is fiction-like. So that prepares them for learning to read and write, that supports them if they're at the stage where they're developing their reading and writing. And even in secondary schools, it helps them with their writing, especially with their creativity as well. And then creativity links not only to language development, but to many other areas, including STEM subjects. And storytelling can expand conversations. Also thinking about discussions and maybe the ways to encourage the use of languages and create that link. Any visual aids are quite useful. So you have photos, you have illustrations. If you're going for a walk, you can point at different things, especially with younger with younger children. With older children, you can sit beside them and play Minecraft to talk to them about what they created in Minecraft, maybe. So read aloud every day. This is more relevant, of course, for younger children, as many teenagers wouldn't really read aloud that much. But reading aloud to your child in your home language is very important for the development. So if parents come and ask for advice, what I can do as a parent to support my child, and I only have 20 minutes a day, I would say sit down and read with them or tell a story. I mean, reading and telling stories are both very useful. So books and reading comes out as one of the most important factors controlling for everything else. So if you look at different families with different socioeconomic background, different things they do, different types of families, books and reading, so families who have many books and who read a lot with their children, to their children then achieve much better in schools, and it goes up to secondary school, and the impact is for both languages and English language development, and also for math and other subjects. So homework in English. So this is where something is sent from school, specifically focusing on developing English. In preschool and early stages of school, I would suggest, and this is the situation where I would use probably English the most. So when children are learning English sounds first, so they are learning phonics, I would do that part of homework in English. So using English. You can compare English sounds to sounds in your language. You can do instructions if you're sitting down and your child needs to match, phonemes to maybe pictures or to specific words. You can do instructions in your home language. Don't feel like you have to use English all the time, but obviously the actual phonics work needs to be done in English. So some explanation can be given in home languages. But then most other subjects can be done fully in home language, if it's your preference. So again, this is just to make this point. I don't feel that if the home learning is around development of English language, that you cannot use home language at all to do this. So especially when children are older, you can read the homework text, for example, in English, but give them instructions in your home language. So you cover both languages at the same time. And some parents may find it easier to read in English than maybe provide instructions, like spoken instructions in English. So they can use their home language, and in that way, they help their children to learn English, but also to improve their home language. So you can have conversations around the homework in using your home language. You can give explanations, you can clarify questions, you can discuss text and its meaning in your home language. It may take some focus and practice on part of parents, and this is where informed decision and strategic decision comes in. You have to remind yourself, you have to decide for yourself how you're going to do it, or how parents are going to do it. So code switching is absolutely fine in families, in households where you have more than one language. And it does not create confusion in children. So they still learn English, they still can learn about phonics, they can still learn about text, even if more than one language is used in the same sentence, or maybe splitting it between you read in English, but you ask questions in home language. So mixing and code switching, as I mentioned, so there are different versions. You can explain the homework, or parents can explain homework in home language, but use English phonics for spelling and repeat, in math, sums and subtractions in home language and English. Children can ask questions in English and parents answer in home language. Or there will be times where English will have to be used, and parents will have to use English as well, especially with older children with secondary school homework. But by that time, children are also more independent, so parents may require less involvement. So you can comment, for example, about their writing, but you can still use home language for the comment. But maybe you say sentence in English, but then explain what you want them to do, how to improve their writing in your home language. Sometimes you can talk about the subject entirely in home language, but then children write, and it depends also on the level of how good children are with their home language, so they can write in English, because they have to write in English in their workbook or homework folder. I would also actually, with younger children, from teachers' point of view, if parents send you something written in their home language and you can see it's not in English, I would praise for that, saying and encourage, saying, yes, great job, and you're helping your child, and it's good to see that you work on, both languages at the same time, that you develop because it's still developing literacy, and which will help development of English as well. If parents send you photos of maybe books they read in their home language with children, again, I would send a note to parents to just encourage them to do it more often. And because parents, I think they want to see how teachers respond if home languages are used, because I know some parents worry that somehow they think teachers really want to use them on the English, and that's why even if the English is not so good, they continue forcing themselves to use English, and actually they put their children at a disadvantage in that way. So if a task is to read a text, you can read text aloud with your child or parents can read the text aloud with the child in English, but then answer comprehension questions in combination of English and home language, or maybe ask a child to retell the story or answer questions in home language. They will reinforce understanding of written text and also establish their home language, especially if it's reception year 1, early stages of primary school. So one parent, one language. This is where you already use, or parents already using English as part of their everyday life. So the homework can be split based on subject, based on skills of children, where they may need more support, or maybe children have better knowledge of contextual language of their home language in math, but not so much if it's older children or chemistry or physics, for example. So maybe math can be done mostly in English if children are just working on a new concept and their English is better, is a stronger language. And then once a child masters it in English, so you have dad who works on that with a child in English, then mom who can gradually introduce home language to explain the same concept in home language. So there will be inevitable switch from English to home language, and it's fine to mix and translate because it's all learning. It all contributes to learning. So reading books from school, I've already mentioned some of the ideas. So where you have picture books for younger children, children can talk about the story in English if they want, and parents can ask questions in their home language. Children can be encouraged to talk about the story in both languages. There are many different ways to do it, and it all supports learning and supports preparation for reading with picture books. And I think if they're already reading, again, retelling story in their home language would help as well. So you have establishing home language, which supports the English, and also the idea about gaining meaning from text, from words put in a specific way together. is reinforced if you do it in two languages. So you do it twice. It's like a repetition. It's like exercise for your brain. You just do it in different. It's like if you are running on different types of terrain. So it's you're still developing, you're improving your physical strength, and it's even better because then, in case of languages, your brain has to work slightly harder to make more connections and association, and it's the best exercise for the brain. So discussing topics, again, you can even maybe do everything, or parents can do everything in English when they're preparing, for example, a poster for a historical event, because all the information will go on poster in English, but then it can be discussed in home language. Or there may be some, if it's a historical event, maybe parents can do some research online or using some books about their parents' country or grandparents' country experiences around that historical event. It gives children this sort of necessity to use that language because information, and they're usually interested, in what happened to their grandparents, what happened to their parents, and their experiences. So children will create this extra motivation to do it, and they will do it in home language. So home language is being improved. They're still learning about the same historical events, so content of the subject is still being worked on. So, and actually they may get even more information compared if they had to use only one language. And it's really not confusing a child. So it's being creative. So creativity is very important. So all the children, of course, there will be a moment, even with generic homework, but in current situation with secondary school children, where homework becomes and learning from home becomes quite complex thing to do. And parents, it's not because of the language, but many parents will struggle just to help their children because their schooling or their experience of school was so long time ago. And if they are not really working in the area of chemistry, physics, of these more specific subjects, they can't really support their children that well. But even then, just talking to your child about what they're doing, and you can do it parents can do it in their home language. So tell me, what you're working on. Just showing that interest will increase motivation in children, in teenagers, in young people to do better, to work harder on their home learning. And again, so there is communication, talking, improvement of home language, learning more words in home language, because in secondary school, English becomes often more and more dominant. So in cases where maybe young people or teenagers only came into secondary school, so their own English is not so good, they can continue working on their English. But if parents don't feel like they have to use English to to support them with chemistry or math, and support these young people in their home language, so they're not losing out on subjects. So there will be maybe separate learning devoted to English, and maybe teachers could send more work or more specific work for those learners, for those pupils. But parents should be encouraged to then work with their children using their home language on all other subjects. So this is just something to think about. There is no really one rule how to do those things, because there's so many combinations of family circumstances, of different levels of different languages, of different preferences, of different types of relationships between parents and children. So in this case, it's really understanding that the important goal is the sort of subject knowledge, if you think about it, rather than language it's delivered in. because if children struggle with vocabulary, words to use to explain it, they can catch up quite quickly. But if they miss on understanding foundations or basics of subject, then it's very tricky to get back to in a short amount of time. And if we think so now, if children continue learning, if they continue improving their subject knowledge, it will be much easier when they are back to school to catch up on the English, if they have some problems at all. But based on evidence and research evidence and my own experience, it will not take much time, but also children will catch up quite quickly when they are back, because they will have motivation to show off in front of their, peers, teachers, and the immersive situation when they are back to school will help them very quickly. And also, if you think about families where it will help children becoming this sort of balanced bilingual adults later on, that's very important as well. So they will learn some hard stuff, and usually those would be STEM subjects in more than one language. So again, which allows them for more opportunities in later life with both education and jobs. And I will stop here for questions.
Thank you very much, Olga. There was a lot of activity in the chat box, but given that we haven't got a lot of time, I'm going to weave 3 questions into one, which are related. So Tracy says, I have Romani children whose parents do not speak English. We really struggle to communicate with them. The children don't really know much language. Google Translate doesn't really help. Any advice on how to communicate with these families? Can we add into the mix Peter, who also says, how can we support use of the first language in home learning when there is limited literacy? So we've got Romani, limited literacy, and Amanda and Shazia, who ask pretty much the same question. Without giving it a nationality, how can parents who only speak their home language or have limited language in English, how can they support with home learning?
Okay, so there are a couple of things. So one, using sometimes or asking for help from other parents who share the language, that usually works quite well, because people trust other people or other parents from their communities, and parents are usually quite willing to participate in different things like school organizers. So using parents peers, you can call them, or bilingual parents to support. So use them as not just translators, because there is way more they would be doing, working with them to explain things, to establish, so talking about homeschool partnerships, to be that link. So that would be one option, because it's tricky if all parents from the same language group do not speak English. Then maybe you could ask somebody from the community as well. With limited literacy, family, I do research in family learning a lot. There are family literacy programs which schools could ask, to be delivered in their school. Obviously, if it's very current situation, there are no family literacy programs running, you could contact organizations who usually run those programs and ask for some materials and activities. So family literacy, family learning programs, looking into those, because usually part of family literacy programs would be talking about languages and how speaking, writing, reading, all these skills come together. And if some languages don't have written language, so you're lost, because we used to think about languages in a very traditional way. We think about learning English in a very traditional way. We have books. Straight away, people think, oh, give them some books, give them some something written, and it doesn't work for all languages. It doesn't work actually for all people as well, even native English speakers. If they have dyslexia, if they have some learning difficulties as parents. So thinking in a creative way, and as I mentioned, talk, talk, and talk. Talking in any language develops your brain in the best way. So encouraging obviously parents to talk, storytelling. It really depends. Then two aspects. It's one, how to improve school parent communication, and what to suggest to parents in order for parents to support their children. Supporting children is easier. They can continue using their home language, whatever language works for them. Home school communication, as I said, maybe parents who could help to establish that link would be the best.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, Olga. If you can switch off your mic now because it creates a little bit of feedback. Thank you very much. Thank you, Olga. It's been a fascinating webinar. You've given us such, a broad range of very useful and practical ideas, but all very well grounded in research. So it's been a fascinating listening to you. I'm going to round up now, but before I close this webinar, I just wanted to remind you that you will get an email tomorrow with a link to a video recording of the webinar and the survey. And that on Thursday, the 21st of May, that is the day after tomorrow, at 4 p.m., there will be a webinar for initial teacher education tutors and mentors on quality teaching for EAL learners in the initial teacher training core content framework. There are still a few places available if you would like to attend it, and there is time until 2 p.m. on Thursday to register. So check the Bell Foundation website for details. Hope you can join us then. So thank you again, Olga. It's been fantastic listening to you and having you. And thank you, everybody, for your participation, for your questions. You've been an amazing audience. So thank you to everyone, and goodbye.